Okay, you're good to go. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for being here. I would like to welcome you to the second distinguished virtual lecture today, which is part of the Institute's Distinguished Virtual Lecture series that aims to delve into the rich and diverse scholarship in the field of international relations. Today, we're very excited to host Professor Stephen Rosow, who is Professor Emeritus at the State University of New York at Oswego. And before I give the floor to Professor Rosow, I would like to state a few words, to say a few words about him. He's a Professor Emeritus of Political Science at this university, where he taught courses in political theory and in an interdisciplinary program in global studies. He received his BA, his bachelor's degree from Columbia University in 1975, and his PhD from the University of Massachusetts Amherst in 1981. He works at the intersection of the history of political theory, critical international theory, and political economy in order to open up questions about the global as a novel spatio-temporal framing of thought. He's the editor with Professor George Andreopoulos of Reconfigurations of Power, Authority, and Territoriality, co-author with Jim George of Globalization and Democracy, and co-author with Walter Opello of Nation State and Global Order. Also, he is the president of the IDSX section of the International Studies Association. His lecture today will be on thinking regions as political space. We all know that regions are deeply rooted in international relations, geographical and geopolitical imaginary and language. And there is a renewed and strong interest in arguing with regions that emerged in the aftermath of the Cold War, probably due to anxieties over transitions and over what the emerging world order would be, and how it should be approached by high-level politicians and academics. So today's lecture is very timely, I feel, especially with how turbulent many regions and sub-regions around the world have proved to be. Before I give the floor to Professor Rosow, I would like to thank once again the director of the Institute, Professor Charalambos Tsardanidis, for facilitating the organization of the lecture series and always embracing it very warmly, and also my colleagues who have helped me enormously with the organization, Ms. Stella Miliotti and Mr. Dimitris Polalis. I would appreciate if everybody turns their microphones off. And in the beginning, we will have the lecture by Professor Rosow. Then we will have a Q&A session with questions and maybe comments and remarks. If you would like to speak or pose a question, please raise your hand, and I will pass the floor to you. So thank you. Without further ado, Professor Rosow, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Effie. Thank you to the Institute for inviting me to do this. I have to say, for a little background, for a very long time, I've been interested in doing work in political space and the reconfiguration of political community in the context of globalization. I never really thought much, actually, about regions. And that's probably the case for most political theorists, as you think about it. Regions, thinking about those sort of divisions of the world into these intermediate spaces, not states, but not the world itself. So, like others, I took for granted, I think, that regions were largely given collections of states. And I never really thought about how different regions came to be and the effects of the particular configurations of regions. So when I went to try and think about it, I'm invited to actually do a paper in Seoul a number of years ago on regionalization. And when I came to think about it, and to think about, it became rather difficult to do, since in the history of Western political thought, the area that I really work in, there was no language of regionalism to sort of write a history of. The concept didn't really arise, distinct concept of regionalism didn't really arise until the 20th century. Nevertheless, there's much discussion going back as far as Aristotle, at least, about different regions of the world. So there are different languages within which regions were actually talked about. And at least according to the Oxford English Dictionary, region as a term first began being used to describe a division of the globe not until the early 16th century. And that suggested to me what I was, in a sort of cursory look back to modern political thought, made sense to me because it coincided in many respects with the discovery of the Americas, with the expansion of European colonial empires. And it just sort of intuitively made sense that this would be a period in which regions, there would be more interest and reason to distinguish regions and to think about what were the characteristics and so on of different regions. So, and it's hard to miss that, then coming back up to the present, it's hard to miss the renewed sense of the importance of regions since the Cold War. Okay. Obviously, you can all speak more, certainly more than I, about the complexity of what's going on in Europe. But clearly within the social theory and social sciences, and particularly in international relations, there was considerably more interest and a sense of the importance of regions since the end of the Cold War, a breakdown of the blocs, and really throughout the later 20th century, especially prominent in the 1990s. I think it starts really before the end of the Cold War, but various social sciences in different ways have tried to come to grips with the ways regions have been changing. Economists began to argue that regional economies, both within and across state boundaries, were becoming more prominent in post-Fordist flexible accumulation capitalism. Geographers and some sociologists, some of whom I draw significantly on in this work, they came to insist on the renewed importance of place, countering increasing emphases on the unities of a globalized, supposedly flat world, on the one hand, or those who argued about non-places becoming the norm on the other. They sought to understand much more the significance of distinctive places and how novel sites of assemblages of economic, political, and cultural power were emerging, quite differently from the way they had been configured during the Cold War. Some sociologists and others emphasize global cities, I think an extremely important development, recognizing ways that new communication systems, while outstripping traditional transportation systems and accompanied by new wide-ranging technologies for transportation, were increasingly connected directly into other global cities and into networks, and the global cities were becoming more and more important as they were, rather than being less important, were becoming more important as connecting post-Fordist economies, and particularly financial connections. New networks among more normative theorists, new networks and forms of cosmopolitan were emerging, some of them linking different cities. And they were creating new sets of relations within and across regions. Political analysts sought to come to grips with increasing claims of regional autonomy, as well as post-colonial and post-Cold War regional configurations, as well as how the versions of authority, rights, and justice could be established within regional organizations. And not just viewing regions, say Europe, as primarily functional, but now viewing them as sites of normative and juridical processes. So in that context, it makes some sense to try and rethink and to sort of, for me as a political theorist, to see how I could contribute something to understanding how regions were changing in this post-Cold War world. So first I want to summarize a bit the main argument, and then I'll just make a few comments about different aspects of the argument. So the main theme is regionalization. And I talk about regionalization as essentially that process of the assemblage of distinct places and people into some abstract space. The emphasis is on not regions as a description of a geographical space, but I use the term regionalization to talk about regions as political and socially constructed assemblages of laws, institutions, cultures, and so on. And it seems to me that regionalization, the process, is fraught with a particular danger, the danger of assimilating, the assimilating of distinct peoples with their particular customs, traditions, and values into some abstract unity. And I think actually that most of the accounts of regionalization that I saw, most of the descriptions of region actually do that. And the tendency of Western political theory and practice has been to, for lack of a better word, homogenize regions as abstract collections of states, economies, and or cultures. And I would argue that only by recognizing the political power that constructs a region and the historical construction of a region, and that renders some peoples within that region invisible, can we really confront the violence and the forms of oppression that often accompany the construction and naming of a region as an abstract unity. I think this is especially the case as the conditions have led to the unraveling of the recent ways in which regions have been constructed. So regions don't pre-exist, I argue. The naming and the ways that the region cobbles together different ideas of space, political power, laws, administrative institutions, and ideologies. Okay, they are all part of the creation of a region. And the end of the Cold War, together with neoliberal global capitalism, has, I think, destabilized not only the redefinition of particular regions, but the very idea of a region as a singular enclosed space. Distinct places, not necessarily states, are becoming sites of connection of the local to wider networks and systems of power, breaking apart and redefining internally different regions of the world. So now I want to make a few remarks about three aspects of the argument. First, I want to talk a little bit about the concept of space that underlies my argument. Second, I want to talk about a little bit and summarize a little bit the historical argument, essentially a very general genealogy of regionalization in modern Western political thought. And third, in conclusion, make some observations and speculation about the changing patterns of globalization in the wake of the Cold War and neoliberal global capitalism. And that can lead, hopefully, to some discussion, as many of you, I'm sure, are much more familiar with particular regions and the developments in particular areas than I am. So first, let me suggest that the concept, I think the concept of space matters to understanding world regions. So one of the first things, and partly as a political theorist and a political theorist who's been concerned with the politics of language for much of my career, came to think that the concept of space, and I wanted to investigate what was the underlying concepts of space. And there's a considerable critical literature that addresses this, and both in international relations, and particularly here thinking of Rob Walker's work, RBJ Walker's work, but in many other areas. And I wanted to draw particularly on some critical geographers. And I'd argue that as preoccupations with linear models of development became widely recognized as inadequate, and together with new digital communications, together with new technologies for making expanded trade and travel easier, social theory became much more interested in countering the occlusion of space and the dominance of time and temporality in social theories that remained well into the era of globalization, and we remained really enthralled to the specter of progress and development. Excuse me. Central's Henri Lefebvre's 1974 productions of space, which became especially influential and sparked debates among a number of geographers and social theorists. For example, Doreen Massey, who I also draw significantly on, John Agnew, Stuart Eldon, David Harvey, John Urey, Edward Soja, and Nigel Thrift. Some main points I take from them. First, space is not given but socially constructed. Space, and political space in particular, is plural rather than unitary. It's fraught with contestations and fraught with fractures and conflicts. Second point that I take from these thinkers is the paradoxical and renewed importance of place in a globalized world. It's paradoxical, and part of the debates, in, for example, among thinkers of global culture, and not only critical thinkers, but the thinkers about the sort of flat world of globalization and liberal political economists who saw place as secondary or just not important in the context of the creation of a global economic, global economy. So it became paradoxical in that it seemed to me and to many sociologists and geographers that place was actually becoming more important. And the third thing that I take from these critical geographers is the contestation of the ways that temporality has been frozen out, or the way temporality has frozen out the concerns about space and the ways that space has been constitutive of the social and political world. Okay, so let me just take a couple of examples here. Henri Lefebvre, who points us really toward how space is actually experienced, how it's lived, and his argument that this is often in contrast with the ways in which it is actually thought and experienced by people on the ground, especially in the context of modern capitalism. Lefebvre, for people who don't know his work, was a Marxist thinker, but also influenced significantly by Nietzsche and Heidegger. He focused in the production of space. He focuses on how space is perceived, conceived, and lived, corresponding respectively to three core concepts in his theory. First, spatial practices. These are the three constituents of political and social space. Spatial practices, which he describes as embracing production and reproduction, and the particular locations and spatial sets characteristic of a social formation. Representations of space, which, again, I'm quoting from him, conceptualize space, the space of scientists, planners, urbanists, technocratic subdividers, and social engineers. And third, what he describes as representational spaces, space as directly lived through the associated images and symbols, and hence the space of inhabitants and users. Okay, another example. So I think those three, looking at space as constructed by those three components: spatial practices, representations of space, and representational spaces, space of lived experience, I found quite useful. Another example of the theory that I found directly helpful was Doreen Massey, late the geographer, whose critical theory in a book called For Space proceeds through what she calls three refusals, okay, that indicate how concepts of space to her are important. The first refusal is she refuses to see the world as a surface that undergirded the exploitation and of the initial encounters with natives in North America. She argues, and many others have argued as well, that it's this concept of an empty Cartesian space, and she refuses to see space as this empty space that made possible and undergirded the exploitation and colonization of the New World. Second, she refuses to view space to the way space has come to be imagined as a function and as function of simply time and development in theories of the inevitability of neoliberal globalization. So it's a refusal to see globalization as inevitable, to see the development of and the progress towards some unified world economy as given. And third, she refuses the reification of place. This is particularly, I think, particularly interesting one. We might talk more about. She refuses the reification of place as a haven of authenticity and real life, separate from the connection to wider spaces of power. And I think what she's getting at here is the way in which viewing space as a kind of haven and an isolated locality has meant that we know we've got no interest or reason to look very closely at how those local places are constituted by wider ranging forms of power and networks of relations. So looking at place as a kind of authentic space of real life has actually been a way of avoiding any critical understanding of the importance of place in wider systems. Okay. And it seemed to me to follow from this literature. And I also would draw a little bit on David Harvey, on particularly also on work by John Agnew, who was, I think, one of the central geographers in reviving the importance of place as a more densely composed space of networks of overlapping relations and of distinct interactions and relations of different cultures, different peoples, different kinds of practices as multiplicities, which makes space in its depth, to use the I think it was Massey's term, and that Agnew focuses on, to show that depth as being important. And I think it's important because I think it's that kind of depth and density of everyday life that the constructing of, and the way in which Western thought has led to the construction of regions, it's that depth that has been occluded. That the Western political thought has tended toward reinforcing views of regions as kind of unitary spaces. And in doing so, has led us away from, and in some sense done some violence to, the local lived and dense experience that it tends to ignore and occlude. Whether we view viewing the Middle East through the lens of being a Muslim region. Well, that ignored, certainly to some degree true, but it ignores the density of relations of different kinds of Islam. Something that Americans probably tend to do this more than perhaps Europeans who are closer, but ignoring all the differences. I continually used to have students when I would talk about the Middle East who would refer to Iranians as Arabs. And I think that speaks to this way of kind of homogenizing and reifying regions. So what I wanted to do was then to take this concept, this critical appreciation of political space, and see what happens if I go back and look at how we've come to think about regions in the Western tradition of political theory, which is my real, has been much of the focus of my work. So I came to, and this is a kind of first cut at a tracing out a set of really, I think, three arguments, or three sets of arguments, three theoretical framings in modern Western political theory that are formulated roughly from the 16th through 19th centuries that I think continue to influence the formation and thinking about and the ways of thinking about and constructing regions. I think a fundamental shift first takes place as European powers come to confront the wider world with the discovery and colonization of the Americas and the continued expansion into Africa and other geographical spaces. And I think, and I've argued this in other places, that colonialism and colonial expansion becomes a central component of the imagining and of the consolidation and formation of modern states. And much of the critical literature in international relations had been talking about this for a long time, where the construction of sovereignty is related not only to domestic developments, but also to the international, that the dichotomy between domestic and international that is read back into early modern thought is really a false dichotomy. And one of the implications of that is that we need to look at the ways in which colonial practices and colonialism and the sense and integration of sovereigns with the wider world were part of, not secondary, not just tactics of, but were part of modern state formation. So my aim in this is not a general history of regionalism in Western political thought, as if that could really be, I mean, it could be done. Somebody with far greater abilities than I would be able to do that. Because as I mentioned, while there was no particular language of regionalism in Western political thought, regions have been talked about a lot. And they've talked about a lot in different discourses and at different times and differently in different places by different elements of the tradition and so on. So what I'm trying to do is sort of, I mean, in some sense, make some sense of the various different frames within which regions were talked about. And doing that with an eye toward the present, an eye toward how the kind of, and I call them tendencies of late modern thought to view regions as sort of unities and ignoring the plurality of and social and political construction of regions and seeing them as singular spaces. So there are three theoretical framings that I talk about. One is the argument of the reason of state. And they're different sort of discursive forms, so which made this even more, in some sense, more difficult. So the first is the argument about the reason of state. Arguably, a tradition forms that that really lasts from the mid-16th through the 18th century. And continues to reverberate and get reinterpreted. So it's the argument about reason of state is one. The discipline of political economy, a second theoretical framing in which regions are talked about. And the third is the tradition of the philosophy of history. Especially, although not exclusively, in its German form emerging with so-called German Romanticism at the end of the 18th century. And these I should add, I should make clear, this is not a causal argument. I'm not saying that this causes, say, contemporary social scientists or Americans and there's establishing of American hegemonic power, that they directly use these as a cause of their approach to regions. But I argue that they provide these three provide I'm sure there are others as well, that provide a repertoire of ideas and arguments that have framed the way in which late 20th century and 20th century international relations, as well as political actors, have thought about regions. Okay, so I'll try and be fairly brief here about each one of these, and we can talk more about them in discussion. Reason of state arose as a set of arguments about securing, legitimizing, and furthering the absolutist monarchies of the 16th through 18th century. And it's interesting, although we can talk more about this, though, although most of its proponents were part of this argument of anti-Machiavellians who explicitly saw themselves as anti-Machiavellians, Jean Baudin, Giovanni Botero, Duc de Sully, Richelieu, they all took from Machiavelli an idea. Machiavelli was not part of this tradition for reasons, and we can talk more about this. I read Machiavelli in many respects as much more closely rooted to an older world than to this modern world of sovereign nation states. But they took from Machiavelli an idea of state interest. Again, I think they developed this out of Machiavelli, because I'm not sure Machiavelli had a concept of state interest, certainly not in a modern sense. Okay, he certainly had a sense of the power of the prince and the ruler, and that it was linked to something, some larger republic or principality. But those, I think, were far from the sense of the modern state. And we could talk about that more if we want to, that interpretation of Machiavelli. Okay, but they took this idea of state interest and harnessed it to the concept of state sovereignty. Okay, and the aim of doing this in the reason of state tradition, I think the aim was to delimit the power of sovereign rulers as they consolidated that power. Okay, they were drawing political authority and right into the center of political space that was still fractured very much by feudal orders, the consolidation of central political institutions and organizations. And in the context of the new conditions of wealth and colonialism, stemming from particularly the influx of silver and gold from the Americas, okay, that enabled a whole lot of new things, not least of which was development of new techniques and strategies and perpetual warfare. And it became a main argument as a reason of state argument, became a main argument supporting the centralization of state bureaucracies, money. Jean Baudin writes a very influential treatise, for example, on the need for centralizing the control of money. Later on the edges of the tradition, Thomas Hobbes will argue there are two things that the sovereign must continue to control. Other things they can farm out to their loyalists and to where else, but they have to control the military and they have to control money. Okay, really part of the centralization, and that, of course, was connected to legitimizing somehow tax collection. And it was this reason of state argument that was used, among others, to justify and legitimize this. And it also, the reason of state argument then became the main argument supporting the centralization of state bureaucracies, and it became a principle of the balance of power system, particularly as it was developed among thinkers in the 18th century, trying to rationalize the division of not only Europe, but also the division of the colonial world into possessions of different sovereigns. Obviously, reason of state is the tradition that is most connected to sovereignty and to projects of sovereign control and mastery of space. Okay, it tended to see space as a centralized and sort of empty field that the sovereign could configure according to its own needs and interest. Okay, so space became sort of a technique of power, and the aim was to enclose and secure borders, and when possible, to expand the borders of the state. Okay, expand into this sort of empty space. So reason of state contributes at least two things to the European regionalization. The division of regions could be, first of all, the division into regions could be a principle of order. Okay, so now there was a rationale for talking about regions more systematically than they had been before. Okay, and we'll see that, say, when we talk about political economy. Okay, and part of my argument is that these become ways that regions and regionalism, although it's an anachronism, but is talked about and is a reason to talk about it more systematically than before. So it contributed the idea that the division of regions could be a principle of order, okay, a balance of power that would temporarily stabilize a hierarchy of powers within and outside Europe. And the second thing that reason of state contributed was that regionalization was a question of relations between rival political communities. Okay, eventually this would get reinterpreted, I think, into the idea that regions are comprised of states, that they are collections of states as the primary agents of seeking to control and master political space. Okay, political economy. I'm going to talk a little less about this because the emergence of political economy, the science of political economy, and its contributions to regionalization are probably better known than some others. So I just want to note a few things about this history. First, prior to the 18th century, there was no distinct science of political economy. The term economy referred not to a system of national wealth, but to a principle for how to live one's life frugally and virtuously. Although in different ways, this was the case for both Catholics and Protestants. It became a distinct science, as I think, again, is fairly well known, only in the 18th century with the physiocrats in France and the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers, including Adam Smith. And although, of course, there were precursors, theories of money, theories of value, theories of what the English called political arithmetic, and so on. And so genealogy of political economy needs to account for those. It needs to account for the emergence of statistics and accounting and so on. But these all came together and sort of coalesced into a science of political economy, not until the 18th century. One way to think about it is the idea of the economy as an object of, as a kind of singular object of analysis emerges slowly and comes to fruition only with really the Scottish Enlightenment, to some degree with the physiocrats. Crucial, of course, was the introduction of the notion of space focused on circulation. Okay, the physiocracy arguments, which again, we could talk more about if people want to. And with also with the physiocrats aspects of natural law that transformed into an idea of a naturalized system that was based on universal principles, which then develops into the idea, and some might say the reification of the market in classical political economy. Second point to make about political economy and regionalization is that the Americas were central to the formation of the science of political economy. Again, I think this is fairly well known, and the Americas are not only were they a fundamental source of wealth that made necessary and to some degree made possible the consolidation of national economies. But it also was a kind of prism. The Americas were a kind of prism through which key concepts of what would become the science of political economy would form. Most notable in this and well known is, of course, Locke's theory of private property and theory of rationality, which I should note, again, we could talk more about this, was still linked very much to older uses of the term economy as a component of more a moral philosophy. But it was leading the way toward regions being situated on a kind of grid of progress and rationality and the accumulation of private property. For Locke, of course, his theory of private property, and he uses the Americas explicitly, as Hobbes and others, and some in the natural law tradition had also done, as sort of the past of Europeans. And Locke says in the second treatise, just paraphrasing, all the world, in the past, all the world was America. And to add to that a little bit, his argument is basically, in the future, all the world will be Europe. And that is because the native peoples didn't recognize the principle of private property, because property private property was justified and developed out of the individual's ownership of their own body and their effort and labor in taking from nature and making it into a source of value for oneself and one's community. Since the native peoples didn't recognize this, European appropriation of the land and colonization was perfectly legitimate. And in fact, Locke tended to think of it as a kind of moral and religious obligation on the part of Europeans, ignoring, of course, the specific people, the kind of depth of place of the Americas. Third point to make about political economy is that it often is a point that's often underplayed in the history of political economy, but that is, I think, crucial to understanding its contribution to regionalization, to modern forms of regionalization, and that is the role of comparative methods. Comparativism derived in part from Aristotle, but developed in modern forms by Baudin and Montesquieu. Okay, the latter especially influential for the Scottish Enlightenment founders of modern political economy, especially and including Adam Smith. Okay, let me turn to, I want to try and move a little more quickly. The third tradition that I think contributes to modern forms of regionalization is the philosophy of history. And by this, I refer to the tradition of the philosophy of history, especially as developed in German thought in the late 18th and 19th centuries. Of course, there are other French thinkers, Rousseau, Italian Giambattista Vico. But these argued that particular places began to give far more importance, to have far more importance, and distinct cultures and regions were far more important. Associated with romantic rejections of the Enlightenment, emerging in connection with the Sturm und Drang movement in literature and art in Germany, rejected the ahistorical assumptions about space in English and Scottish Enlightenment thought. And best thing to do is a brief quote from Herder, Johann Gottfried von Herder. It's a critique of the stages of development theory that's in his Reflections on the History of Mankind. As a quote, it has been customary to divide the nations of the earth into hunters, fishermen, shepherds, and husbandmen, and not only to determine their rank in civilization from this division, but even to consider civilization itself as a necessary consequence of this or that way of life. This would be very excellent if these modes of life would determine themselves in the first place, but they vary with almost every region, and for the most part run into each other in such a manner that this mode of classification is very difficult to apply with accuracy. So the concern is with the kind of autonomy and expressiveness of different cultures. While Hegel's Orientalism, developing out of this, Hegel, a student of Herder's who breaks with him in fundamental ways, Herder's Orientalism is well known. The famous quote from the philosophy of history: the East knew and to the present day knows only that one is free, the Greek and Roman world that some are free, the German world knows that all are free. Okay. In general, in spite of this Orientalism in Hegel and appearance of a certain determinism, the tradition of philosophy of history paid far more attention to the distinctiveness, local character of space. And they attempted to link those local spaces to a kind of universal history of humanity. And it's especially the case for some 19th century advocates, particularly significant, I think, for Wilhelm Dilthey and some of the German historical school, who we ought to note were extremely influential to Max Weber and Max Weber's development of his method of Verstehen and interpretation. And I'm going to cut some of this a bit short. But just make one more comment and then turn to a conclusion so we can open this up for discussion. Central to the philosophy of history tradition is the intimate relation between universal and particular. Okay, one way to think about this in terms of regions is that regions, from this view, become relational. Regions can only be understood in terms of their own autonomous development and expressions, almost a kind of anthropological sense of the depth of the lived experience of a region, but they can only be understood in terms of their interaction and relationality with other regions and with other systems of more wide-sprung relations. And a brief quote from Dilthey can be helpful. Our knowledge of what is given in lived experience is extended through the interpretation of the objectifications of life. And this interpretation, in turn, is possible only on the basis of the subjective depth of lived experience. Likewise, the understanding of what is singular depends upon the general knowledge inherent in it, which in turn presupposes understanding. Finally, the understanding of a part of the historical course of events can attain completeness only through the relating this part to the whole, just as the universal historical survey of the whole presupposes the understanding of the parts united in it. In the progress of the human sciences, we see at every point the reciprocal influence of lived experience and understanding as we apprehend the human world around us, and the reciprocal dependence of the universal and singular knowledge, and finally, the gradual illumination of the world of human spirit. Okay, this connects to the hermeneutic tradition, of course, of which Dilthey is an important figure. Okay, so regions appear as worlds. So the tradition of philosophy of history can lead in a number of directions, and I think does lead in a number of directions in later understandings of regions, both toward the kind of reification of the region as a unity and in some more Hegelian forms, but also in its more interpretive forms as a more kind of anthropological appreciation of the depth of lived experience of the region. Okay, so conclusion. I think in modern political thought and in contemporary regionalism, the tendency to reify regions as unitary abstract spaces remains powerful. The three theoretical framings discussed today provide a repertoire of concepts, ideas, arguments, inclinations, and even more inchoate, sometimes affective associations that have and continue to have led to regions being taken for granted as descriptive, unitary, and most most often as collections of states. From IIER's reduction of the lived experience of regions to states and hierarchies of states, to modernization theory and much of comparative politics that sought to reduce regions to manifestations of universal abstract laws, to cultural homogenization, such as Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, regions have appeared as abstract unitary entities, often representative of spaces that pose dangers and threats to the interests of major Western powers. This has made intervention easier for those powers, as the real lived experience and subjectivity of the people on the ground, and often their human rights, have been ignored or subordinated as secondary considerations. After the Cold War, it seems to me this has become more difficult to sustain. At the end of the Cold War, together with the neoliberal global capitalism, is destabilizing not just particular regions, but the very idea of a region as a general abstract unity. Regionalism has become important during the Cold War, became important, I should say, during the Cold War, harboring alternatives to traditional state-centered formations. To Europeans, so this was already going on during periods of the Cold War. To Europeans, question of how to negotiate national identities, to move beyond cooperation to a framework of shared institutions and shared identity. In post-colonial states during the Cold War, regionalism appealed to some as a form of resistance to post-colonial interventions of particularly the United States and in some cases former European colonial powers. Regions have indeed become more important in international politics in the context of reconfiguration and reorganization of global life at the end of the 20th and into the 21st centuries. New forms of warfare, financialization and networks of global cities, offshore manufacturing, subregions and sectors, digital information networks in which localities can link directly into wider spatial networks, climate change, labor and refugee migrations, which I think are extremely important in fracturing the whole idea of what a region is, have at the same time made the idea of a region as a self-contained space less plausible. In response, I think we're seeing a number of shifts in regionalization. One is the attempt internal to regions to reestablish and redefine their borders, and to some degree to redefine themselves as a political community. Europe is an obvious example here. But North America, I think, in interesting ways, is another. Not only is it redefining itself through regional trade agreements like NAFTA, but I think even more through population movements. Immigration is creating major shifts in a number of ways. For example, linking immigrants and local communities, immigrant communities directly from the US and Canada to home villages and home communities in Central and South America. Immigration is likely to challenge, I think, the ways regions have understood themselves and been constituted. Okay, these have been accompanied by struggles and violence, as major powers have often attempted to impose more unitary definitions and understandings of regions. So let me stop there. I hope that didn't go too overly long. I guess open it up to questions.
Professor Rosow, thank you so much for this very, very interesting lecture. Just let me summarize a little bit for the latecomers. You're using the concept of regionalization in order to examine how change is affected in regions. And you are trying to do that, usually it's being done by examining the space, making historical arguments, and the changing patterns of globalization, especially the term neoliberal globalization. You are examining the reason of state three parameters: the reason of state, which is actually we could say that is the basis for the balance of power, the way we perceive it today in IIR theory. Even though it came in conflict with original Machiavellian ideas, because from what I understand, Machiavelli, those ideas were more concentrated on virtue, and then Baudin came, like gathering from your lecture, then Baudin came and reintroduced the concept of rationalism as it is grounded in interest, and how this way sovereign nation states are created. From political economy, which introduced comparativism in this field of study, and philosophy of history. So essentially opening up regions to critical analysis. I don't want to take more time by me analyzing. We already had this extremely interesting lecture. I would like to open the floor to questions by the audience. If you would like to speak, please turn on your microphone, raise your hand, introduce yourself, and the floor is yours. I have also, there is a new message. Okay, from Professor Tsardanidis, his microphone is not working. So he would like me to read his comment, a question. In our times, on the one side, through interregionalism, large regions are connected with Europe and East Asia. And on the other, at a smaller scale, we have cities to function like states or even like regions. The most important, he thinks, for the construction of regions and even the creation of civilization, as J. Quinn argues, how the world made the West is connectivity. How political theory explains connectivity as a leading force of how regionalism is constructed and, more importantly, is perceived. And if you permit me, Professor Rosow, before you reply to this question, because I had a very relevant question, is why you chose, Professor Tsardanidis here is using the term regionalism. And I always, listening to you, I had this question in my head, why you chose to use regionalization instead of regionalism? Where in IIR theory, we perceive regionalization as the framework that actually divides regions, and regionalism as the framework that integrates regions. Of course, you spoke about the pluralist aspect you want to attribute to that. But yes, if you could please reply, thank you.
Well, that seems to be two questions, but not completely separate. The first question. Thank you for the questions. I mean, that's the question of connectivity of different regions in political theory. Wow. I'm not exactly sure how to answer that. Other than thinking through, I've never thought of it quite that way. And I think one of the things that we clearly need to do, and I probably need to do much more of, is think about the ways in which, if what you mean by connectivity is relationality, what are the different sorts of relations? And I would say that in plural, that connect different regions. Because it would seem to me that there were different kinds of sort of connectivity. When I think when the term connectivity raises to me, the neoclassical economic idea of the market. okay, where you different people come to but are somehow connected. So I sort of prefer, I mean, I'm stumbling a little bit because I haven't really thought about this. Um, I prefer the term relationality. And if that's what you mean, I think political theory needs to look at that and does to some degree look at that as a plurality, as a set of vectors, which are multiple, for how relations are created. I think a good example, you mean, and this, I thought you were getting at this more, was we could look, if we look at global cities, in certain respects, global cities are sort of acting like, and in some sense, becoming themselves regions. And you look at both in terms of the geographical structure of cities, where they have tended in many parts of the world. Here I'm thinking particularly in places in Latin America, in the United States, I think to some degree in Europe as well, where they have absorbed rural populations. And what they've done is they've absorbed rural populations, become in themselves, in a sense, like regions. In some sense, they sort of have become regions. And particularly thinking here of the networks of relations between immigrant communities in many of the global cities around the world, and the network of relations that they create and are creating between those cities to which they've migrated and the local communities, often now suburbs and exurbs of major cities, and that they came from. I don't know if I'm being as clear. I mean, I'll give the example of my own neighborhood in Brooklyn, in which we have a large number of Central American immigrants, including the super in my apartment building, and many others who regularly not only go back to, in his case, Colombia, but to places, other parts of Central America, a lot of Mexican. But they also they go back regularly. They travel, no matter how poor they are, they'll travel back home and go back and forth, where much of their family is in their home, their home country or region. And they'll also, of course, send funds back and have created various kinds of networks. So that some people have actually described parts of my neighborhood as a kind of extension of Central America. Because employment, for example, institutions for some kinds of jobs, say construction, superintendents. They'll advertise jobs for superintendents in buildings in my neighborhood, not in the United States, but back in Central American communities and cities there. So the relations are becoming more direct. It's almost as if the relations are now on multiple plural levels directly between people. There are relations between institutions, between corporations, between governments. And they're all on that multiple level. So I don't know if that gets at the idea of connectivity that you were driving at. I just don't know if I've understood clearly enough. But as a political theorist, my preference would be, just to answer in general, would be to translate the idea of connectivity into relationality. Okay. As in terms of using the term regionalization, I used it as because I wanted the more active form to refer to not the division of the world. And I understand what you're saying, and I didn't take this into account, where some IIR talks about regionalization as the dividing up of the world into different regions. That's not how I meant it. I meant it because I didn't want to use the term regionalism or regionalist because I wanted to refer to the way the processes and relations through which regions as a particular form and a particular assemblage were constructed. So I used the term regionalization to refer to the active construction. Maybe a better way of putting it is the regionalizing of spaces. Okay, not how they're divided, but in some sense, how they're actually connected. Because region is a term that I think emerges as a way of both describing and characterizing a particular geographical area, but also as a technology for connecting particular peoples and particular areas and sets of resources to wider networks, to other peoples, and to, in some sense, the world orders. So I hope that answered it. I'm not sure if I did, but.
Yes, thank you. It answered it. If there are any questions, please raise your hand, or even if you have a comment. I also see that Professor Tsardanidis' microphone now is okay. So if Professor, you would like to comment and turn on your microphone and converse with Professor Rosow.
Sorry about that. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Ah, thanks. With this technology. Now, you know, Facebook was down today for 1 hour at least, and connectivity did not exist. What I mean by connectivity, it is not only through exchange of goods like the economy say, but also of ideas and perceptions. Because there is the argument that, and this is why I mentioned Quinn with his new book about how the world made the West, that without connectivity, the Greek civilization as a concept, as a region, will not exist because it was connected not only with trade, but also through, let's say, ideas and, for example, some perception from ancient Egypt, also from the Phoenix, the alphabet. So it's much more broader concept. And today is much more through the technology, there are new roads which connect the people and connect regions through the market, for example. You could transfer money from one place to another. And that is what Effie has mentioned about regionalism, that connecting, getting together and forming new entities, not only on a geographical basis, but also on other bases. And we could say in international relations that through regionalism, we are approaching globalization. Regionalism is a stepping stone towards globalization. And some people argue that we will have mega regions because of this. Not states, the state is retreating the concept of national state, but also we are moving towards a mega region. Of course, in the last 10 years, we see the process of the globalization, of the Europeanization. The nation state is coming back as a concept. There is resistance to these trends. But I think, this is my opinion, that it is inevitable because of these networks connecting each other. You see that on the one hand, the creation of mega regions through interregionalism, and the other, what we have mentioned about global cities, which Singapore is a city, but also is a city-state. Or, for example, Athens in Greece is the most important city, and about 70% of the economy of Greece is produced in Athens. So Athens is like a region, or Greece is like Athens. This is what I have in my mind about connectivity. Thank you very much.
Now I understand completely. I was thinking, I wasn't thinking of connectivity quite the same way, but yes, I think connectivity in the sense of digital communication systems, for example. I think there are a lot of different ways in which knowledge translates and transfers from place to place. And we can talk about it in terms of, I think what you're getting at is the way digital communication systems are redefining the linkages between peoples and between people, between areas and spaces, is recreating. And I think it's exactly one of the sets of forces that I think is undermining the traditional ways in which we've understood regions. And not the least, certainly within places, like Greece, and it sounds like what you're describing for Athens is going on in many places, including the United States, where more and more of the economies are being pulled toward particular global cities. And New York, Chicago, and that is in part because those cities are locked more into the global economy. But it's also, and I think the expectation, I should say, of many scholars and observers was they were expecting the opposite. They were expecting the ability to have digital communications systems and networking and the kinds of organizations that you could do, and everything being done over the internet and so on. They were expecting that to fracture cities. They were expecting that everybody was going to be out in the suburbs, or they were going to be on their lakefront cabins doing high finance and so on. It hasn't happened. And even with at least here, and I know this is the case in some places, in some cities in Europe as well, even with the pandemic and the closing of and people doing more and more remote work, they haven't gone. Some have gone to far off sort of vacations much, but most have gone to suburbs. And most have gone to now these places that never used to be directly connected to cities are, through this connectivity, in some sense, really parts of cities. I mean, it's hard to describe it that way because they're so fragmented and fractured. Okay, so you have people who are doing their primary work and feeding the economy centered in New York City, who are 300 miles away in Syracuse, where I used to live. Just almost 300 miles away. But through connectivity, they're in some sense part of New York City. They're working in New York City, but they're not. And I think that's redefining the whole sense of certainly economic space. And clearly redefining regions. Okay, and I think that's one of the sets of forces that I think is undermining. And I think it would be interesting, and it's one of the things I've thought of doing, is to looking at how different forms of knowledge in systems of communications, or what we might call systems of connectivity, how those worked in the development of modern thought, modern political thought. So culture, for example, one of the things that we notice is that certainly by the 17th and 18th century, cultural production is developed through connections, through connectivity. Music, for example. Okay, I'm an opera nut, and you clearly notice the ways in which opera is. You have distinct, in the 18th century and 17th century, you have distinct forms, but they're developed through connectivity. They move throughout Europe, and so on. I should probably stop. So I think what you mean by connectivity is one of those sets of forces that I think is undermining and changing and transforming regions, and particularly the vision of regions as unities. I think they're making them much more fragmented. I hope that answer is better than my first answer.
Thank you, Professor Rosow. Is there any other question? I don't see any hands raised. I have a question, since there's no question by the audience. You spoke at some point about the tension between differences and homogenization and universalism. And yes, differences versus universalism. So I was thinking about homogenization and oversimplification, and treating regions solely as political spaces may lead to oversimplification and homogenization. And it risks overlooking internal diversities, variations, and complexities within regions, as political analysis may flatten, what you talked about, the rich cultural, social, and economic differences in a given area. So in order to address this critique, maybe scholars should adopt a more nuanced approach, recognizing that regions are multifaceted and acknowledging the internal dynamics that shape political spaces. And I would like to ask you, how do you think could this approach be shaped? In what framework? Thank you.
I think that's a great point. I mean, I think that tendency to I mean, homogenize is not the best word, but the tendency to oversimplify and to fixate on one aspect of a region and to deny the subject deny the subjectivity, deny the internal developments and internal interactions that construct the region. I think there are a number of ways to do it. I think there are, although I think the tendency in certainly in international relations, has not has and which is partly what I'm trying to tease out is how that tendency has become so strong, and what are the underlying kind of history that has made possible thinking about those regions in that oversimplified way. I think there are a number of ways that do it. One is, I mean, you got to be more interdisciplinary, to put it simply. I mean, we need anthropology. We need alternative voices from those regions. So we need to do in part what ISA is trying to do to some degree, what the International Studies Association is trying to do, which is to bring in more different approaches from the particular regions. Now, often here, one of the effects of connectivity, often different regions of different parts of the world simply take the norms and paradigms of Western international relations and Western social science and just adopt them. But often they don't. I mean, there are lots of post-colonial theories, for example. So I think we need to give those more room. I think we need denser histories and different kinds of histories. I mean, I work in, for example, this is a different area, but I've done a lot of work with Foucault's work. People forget that first and foremost, Foucault's analyses are dense histories. They're almost, in some ways, they share a lot with the anthropologist Clifford Geertz in looking for real local histories. So I think we need to incorporate history more. IR certainly needs to incorporate history more. It needs to engage post-colonial perspectives more. It needs to, in some sense, be more anthropological and draw in anthropologists. Okay, it's one of the reasons I've been interested in interdisciplinary perspectives and interdisciplinary methods and interdisciplinary forms of social inquiry. And I think we have to, and this is something I've written about in the past, I think we have to follow the great economist Albert Hirschman. We need to follow Hirschman and forget about paradigms, and not try and simply do paradigms, but to actually do the history, do local histories, and look at what's there. And some of the people that some of the social scientists who, when I do social science and political science, which I rarely do actually, I mostly do more philosophy and theory and history. But when I look to social scientists, I look more to people like James Scott, for example. And doing sort of very local kinds of histories, and using the voices of people in regions, in areas, in other political spaces, to disaggregate those spaces. And I think what the social forces that are emerging now are breaking those apart. This is in part what I meant by saying, I think the costs, to put it a different way, the costs of continuing to view regions as unitary political spaces, the costs are going up. I think the cost is greater resistance, more violence in many places. As people see the world and engage with, and mostly importantly, engage with and connect to the world in very, very different ways. Okay, in ways that aren't connected necessarily with their own states. Okay, so the United States persists in seeing the world through states and seeing, say, the Middle East through, we've got to prop up states. We can't look other ways. The only solution to the Palestinian crisis is a two-state solution. Okay, rather than perhaps exploring other ways in which people do actually on the ground connect to the world that might lead to other kinds of political organizations, looser forms of organization. I would venture to say more democratic forms of organization. So, so again, for IR, what the discipline of IR needs to do is to get certainly beyond its statist biases, to engage more local, particularly post-colonial, but also local voices. And for that, it needs to be more interdisciplinary, engaging more anthropologists, historians, and bringing those all together. Okay.
So
perhaps in institutes like yours.
We're trying to do that, but what I gather from your reply is that yes, in IR we have the problem that we tend to focus too much on state centrism, and this is the main problem that we need to overcome. But how to overcome it in an era that revisits nationalism and populism and protectionism, and we see it with the American elections, we see it in Europe right now, the rise of all the far-right parties. So state centrism, as you say, and from what I gather from your replies, that you're advocating for a more holistic framework. But how to overcome state centrism, especially in IR, the focus on state centrism? Interdisciplinarity, of course, is an avenue. But again, it's so abandoned, the field in the role of state and this level of analysis, that I think it will be extremely difficult to introduce a new pathway. How do you feel about that?
It's extremely difficult. I mean, a number of critical thinkers, I think including myself, started to do this, try to do it in the back 1980s, 1990s. And it's made some inroads, but it's difficult. I think we need to say we might revisit Steve Smith when he was president of the now the head at Exeter University in Britain. Mm-hmm. When he gave his ISA presidential speech, I don't remember what year it was, he talked about gatekeepers. And part of the problem was that the major journals, the major job centers were quite narrow and wanted to preserve their dominance and hegemony. And much of that was expressed in particular methodologies and ensuring that the only people who are going to get tenure and the people who are going to get jobs are the people who did the same kind of work, very much state-centered kind of work that they were doing. I think that has broken down, had broken down for a while. My sense is that in IR, although I do again confess, I don't follow the field of IR all that closely. But my impression is that it's gone back a bit in IR to a kind of more gatekeeper kind of system. And I mean, certainly in security studies, there's been a kind of revanchism at least in the US. I think there are other things, securitization theory is coming out of Scandinavia, for example, is very different and has made some real inroads. But yeah, it's difficult. And there are, I think there are some, there are some signs of change. But I think it's going to be an ongoing struggle, in part because I think it reflects the discipline of IR has always been an American discipline, always connected to the furthering of American power. And I'm not sure that has changed all that much. Somewhat. To the extent it continues, it's likely to continue this, I think, dangerous state centrism that misses so much of what's going on in the world.
Thank you. So your critique essentially is that the analysis, the political analysis of regions as they happen right now may not sufficiently address power asymmetries and hierarchical structures within and between regions. And we need a critical examination of power relations and the perpetuation or disruption of regional hierarchies in order to overcome state centrism, right? From what I gather. Yeah.
That's a better way to put it than I did. That's exactly right.
Thank you. Are there any questions or any comments? Okay, and with that, I think we came to the end of the event. Professor Rosow, I have no words to thank you. Thank you so much for the honor to accept our invitation, to discuss with us, to lecture, give us your invaluable insights. I would also like to thank the audience, the scholars and students and international relations enthusiasts who were here with me, with us and attended the lecture. Thank you so much to everybody. And with that, we're closing the second lecture of the series. Professor Rosow, if you would like to say the last word.
Oh, no, just thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you to the audience for listening.
Thank you so much. We're very honored to host you and learn from you. Professor Tsardanidis, maybe you would like to have the closing comment?
I would like to thank Professor Rosow for this excellent lecture. I enjoyed it very much, and we shall try to, in few days, to upload this lecture with his permission, of course, if he likes to do that.
That's okay. It's okay with me.
Okay.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everybody who attended. Thank you to Professor Rosow. And we are very grateful for attending our lecture series. See you the next time. Have a
Yes,
good night or
thank you
good
very much.
day.
Thanks to everyone.
Bye.